I represent Social Cipher, an edtech company that makes social and emotional learning games for neurodivergent students. The All Kinds of Mind podcast is all about sharing tips, strategies, and insights to support the professionals who work with neurodivergent students. Today, we have Vanessa Castañeda Gill, the founder of Social Cipher, as our guest, and we're going to be talking about the intersectionality of neurodivergence, race, and gender. So, thank you, Vanessa, for being here.
Wow, thank you so much for having me, dear.
Is it surreal to be on your own company's
Honestly,
podcast?
I never thought I could be on a podcast like this, but here I am. Kind of crazy. All you got to do is build a company and then you're here.
I just feel like there are probably simpler ways, but this works too.
This has been my plan all along, to be honest.
Okay, so for the listeners who don't know who you are, can you introduce yourself, what you do at Social Cipher, and your connection to neurodivergence?
Yeah, for sure. So, yes, as you said, my name is Vanessa. I am the CEO and co-founder of Social Cipher. Um, Basically, at Social Cipher, what I do, I mean, I founded the company back in 2018. I've been running it for over 6 years now. A lot of my job is really setting the sort of direction and role of the company. And what Social Cipher does, like you already really put, is that we make social emotional learning games that help neurodivergent youth really understand themselves, advocate for themselves, and understand the world around them, as well as help the professionals who work with them have the resources to better support neurodivergent youth. Um, yeah.
Okay, so can you tell us more about like your background and like how the different parts of, well, explaining your identity and then how those different parts of your identity have impacted your experience as a neurodivergent person?
Definitely. So, I identify so I'm Latina. I am Mexican American. I'm also autistic and ADHD. So I was diagnosed with autism and ADHD when I was 14. I had a lot of, difficulties with the diagnosis itself, in terms of representation, which I know we'll get to later. But long story short, I really felt like I had to fit into this mold, could not fit into that mold because of my intersectionality and who I was, and the fact that I really didn't see that represented in autism anywhere. And so when I couldn't fit to that mold, I had a lot of mental health difficulties. I really had a lot of shame around my diagnoses and hid my diagnosis for over 6 years. And I ended up becoming a neuroscience researcher, originally to try to fix my brain and try to, quote unquote, be normal, which was very sad. But through my neuroscience research, I really started to understand my brain in a new way. I found community and I really found a passion for helping people. So I started Social Safer to be able to make something that would support people like myself. And essentially, I think what we're doing and what I really bring myself to work every day to do is to build something that I really needed as a young person and that I would have wanted and benefited from.
I love that. And I feel like because you are personally connected to the mission, that keeps it really focused, and keeps you working from a place of understanding what these students are going through and how they might possibly be feeling and all of that. So I love that. Um, sorry, my chair is squeaking just for listener. Hopefully my microphone isn't that good that you hear it, but
I don't.
okay, great. So you said that you hid your diagnosis for 6 years. When were you diagnosed, and what made you decide to stop hiding it?
Yeah, so I think this is kind of where intersectionality plays in a lot. So I would describe my adolescence as a lot of hiding. So in addition to hiding my neurodivergence from anyone and everyone, I was also doing a lot of hiding of my heritage. So I went to a majority white school. I grew up. In my household really being raised by a Mexican family. Spanish is my first language. I did not learn or regularly speak English till I was, like, in kindergarten. So it was a lot of hiding of, my school lunches every day. I was so avoidant of wearing hoops, which I proudly embrace them now, but I was super avoidant of wearing them when I was younger because I felt like I was gonna look too Mexican. I really would avoid like I think in middle and high school especially, I would avoid speaking Spanish in public, even though that's what we spoke at home, just because I wanted to fit in and be as, quote unquote normal as possible. And so I think that with all of that sort of hiding happening, um, that's kind of they kinda went hand in hand. And I think that especially in, like, majority white spaces or spaces where majority neurotypical spaces, that's sort of your default that you go to. You kinda go to this masking of anything that makes you different and that makes you
Mhm.
you. And so that's kinda the way I approached it for a long time.
Yeah, that's definitely understandable. I get that. So what made you decide to stop hiding?
Yeah, it was I think that a lot of it was later on when I started Social Cipher, to be honest.
Oh,
Kind of as I was saying, like I hid my diagnosis until I was almost 21 years old. So it was like 14 to 21.
wow.
Um, and so it wasn't until I was well into college and I had been introduced to more diverse people that looked and thought like me, that thought it was cool to be actually passionate and interested things that came from different socioeconomic classes, which made me a lot more comfortable, especially as someone who grew up, in a single parent household and did not, we didn't really have much money. Like I think that having just I guess I would call a representation of that sense, just
Mhm,
having people that, had they didn't always have all of the aspects of me, and sort of all of those areas, but every person kind of had an aspect that I could relate to, and that was a huge difference. So I think being in college and being around and sort of finding my people was a really, really big, part of me kind of finally embracing that, and sort of, I was speaking Spanish again, and I was really proud of it. I was, introducing all of these people at my school, who were coming from different cultures to mine, because I was like, "Oh, hey, I have something new to teach these people, and they're not gonna be weird about it." And I think that, like, for my neurodivergence, I think that so many people, whether they were neurodivergent or not, had special interests. And so I was able to freely explore mine and be excited about mine too. And people were actually willing and excited to learn. And I think with Social Safer, that building this company just also got me a lot into it. I think that, when you have to, when, when, when I took up this role of being the CEO and kind of being the founder of Social Safer, I knew that I was going to have to kind of be the representation and the role model for a lot of these young people. And I was kind of like, I mean, in the very beginning, I was terrified of telling my story. I didn't want to tell people about any aspect of my identity, especially about being neurodivergent. But people would ask me, like, why did you start this company all the time? What am I going to say? Like, of course, I started this company because I'm neurodivergent. So I think I had to come to terms with that really quickly and be like, if I want kids to be able to be confident in telling their stories and to be proud of what makes them different and of how their mind works, then I have to be the first to do it. And so I have to get over it. And I think I truly, truly started embracing all these aspects of my identity at that point because who else is going to do it?
very true. You are the only one who can embrace your identity, and I think it's so interesting that you felt the need to hide multiple aspects of your identity, and that really speaks to the importance of intersectionality and for
Mhm.
educators to understand that their students are not only probably feeling pressure to hide their neurodivergence, but also to hide their culture, their race, their ethnicities, because it's outside of what might be the norm in that space. And
Mhm.
so I love that also view yourself as a role model, as that representation, and recognize a lot of people need that. And educators also have to realize, like, students need that representation. They don't need to see people that look like you as the teacher all the time or look like the majority of the other students, people who look and think and everything else just differently. So I really like that you didn't just think about that, you actually were like, "Okay, I'm gonna be that representation, and I'm gonna create something that brings that representation as well." So, from the other standpoint, in your culture, like your Latina culture, how did those expectations and, like, cultural norms influence the way that you understood neurodivergence?
Oof, so many in so many ways. I think that, so there's a lot of stuff. I think that in one way, another parallel between sort of my culture as a Latina and, being neurodivergent is this idea of not being enough. So in Spanish, there's always this phrase that's like "ni de aquí ni de allá," which is like being not from here nor there, right? And so this is a sentiment among, especially specifically like Mexican Americans, is a big sentiment of like I'm not white enough to be, Mexican, like from Mexico, but I'm also not Mexican enough to, or sorry, I'm not white. I'm not Mexican enough to be very like Mexican from Mexico because I was born in America. But I'm also not white enough to be American born and white. So you're
Mhm.
kind of constantly stuck in the middle. And it was also I felt this a lot. You're constantly questioning if you're Latino enough, if you're Mexican enough. And I was also kind of applying this to my neurodivergence, like, oh, well, the stereotypes of autism are saying that like if you're autistic, you don't speak, or you don't connect with people, or blah blah blah. Like, and so I was kinda like, "Well, I just must not be autistic enough, or I must
Mhm.
not be neurodivergent enough." And so those principles kind of like, can, especially when you possess all of these different identities, like, they can kinda bleed into each other with the way that you treat them. And I think in terms of I understood it how I understood neurodivergence through a lens of, uh, being Latina, um I think there are a lot of things. So one of them was that like uh in Hispanic culture especially, there's a huge expectation of being productive all the time. And it's like you just work hard, you work through stuff, you kind of push down the emotions of it and just you work your way through it, right? So like for a lot of my childhood, there wasn't really a time where you were like intentionally resting. You were just expected to always be doing productive stuff, whether it's cleaning, working with the family, uh watching siblings, or, just doing actual work, right? Um, so I think growing up especially, I thought that like I must just be lazy. Like I must best be lazy. I must not, have this aspect that everyone in my culture supposedly has because I can't get myself to do certain things. I am like when in reality, I was processing things slowly. I was burnt out. And I probably just didn't have the dopamine that I needed to actually get these tasks done. And I just needed rest. And I think that along with that, of there's a big difficulty also in asking for help. So in Latino culture, there's a lot of pride, which is awesome in a lot of ways. But I think that that pride also goes towards like, you don't ask for things unless it's from people directly in your family. And even then, sometimes you don't, right? And so when it comes to asking educators or asking admins or, even like me in the classroom asking for help on something, I wouldn't because you just don't. In our culture, it's very, very much not a thing to ask for help. It's kind of seen as a sign of weakness that you can't work it out and get it done yourself. So you just don't. So, especially with like the thinking I'm lazy paired with the, oh, I can't ask for help with this because that just means I can't do this and I'm incapable. I think all of that kind of made me view neurodivergence as something of like, well, this just makes me useless, right? Like, that's
Mhm.
really what I thought.
Yeah. So with that being the culture, like, was neurodivergence something that people were knowledgeable about or what at that time?
Yeah. I think so. I will say my mom has been always really, really good at learning and understanding my neurodivergence. I think it's because my mom did work in education and would like go to the library and read books about autism to really
Oh, okay.
understand it. So she's always been, kind of my biggest advocate. And she would do things like help me figure out like little hack the home, right? Like she would put me on a stationary bike so that I would do my reading because that like gave me a repetitive action so that my brain wouldn't get bored and distracted, right? Or
Mhm.
she'd like, I still use this egg timer. Like all the time, literally used it yesterday. And I have been using this since like the 6th grade, because this timer gives me a visual representation of time because my brain does not understand how time works and how to estimate it. So she's been really great with supplying things like that. But for example, like my uncles and my grandma, like for the longest time, they were kind of like, "Oh, well, I don't see anything wrong with her," right? And there's
Mhm.
already something wrong with that statement, right? Like, the fact that they were like, "Oh, if she has autism, something must be wrong. Like, there must be wrong things about her, and I don't see that." Um, or a lot of the time, I know I was actually talking with my mom about this because, I was young when a lot of this happened, but a lot of the time, like, my mom would try to explain it, and they'd be like, "Oh, no, I think she's just really lazy. Like, I just think she needs more discipline." Or they would say things like, oh, the big one was like, I had no common sense, right? And so they were like, oh no, she's not she just doesn't have common sense. Like she just doesn't know how, sarcasm or like social interactions. No common
Mhm.
sense. That must be it. And the other one, like, um, they would think that, I wasn't autistic. I just was easily distracted. Again, needed more discipline. Um, And I think that, another way that this showed up too is that, like, honestly, kind of true. Like Latinas, we tend to be loud, and I love that in doses. Like we tend to be loud. We're very loving. And so at family gatherings, like I would hide in the closet sometimes because it would be too much, and they would think I was just antisocial.
Mhm.
So a lot of it was very much against labels and not their perception was very much, "Oh, if she was autistic, then, like, we would know there would be something wrong, there would be, like, she would have things that were wrong with her." But no, they'll separate the idea of a label, from, socially viewed as positive or negative traits, and just kinda call those traits and not want to label it at all. Yeah, and then I guess lastly, like, another thing is that as autistic people, we might express emotions in different ways, and so, like, when I was younger, I would be called the stone because I wouldn't cry a lot, or I wouldn't cry at sad things. I wouldn't express emotions, as, vividly, or as vivaciously all the time, and so yeah. A lot of it was just these separated traits that would never be called autism because that would mean something is a source of shame or something wrong with the child. Um, that's what I've experienced and what I think a lot of families experience that don't have the full story on what neurodivergence is.
Yeah, that's and I'm sure that hearing all of that as a child definitely probably contributed to you wanting to hide because if you have to try to hide it from your family, then of course you're gonna try to hide it from people at school and in the community because I think that a lot of people kinda go through that when they're
Mhm.
diagnosed. Just based off of me being a former teacher and having students who are autistic and stuff, like, they do go through thinking something is wrong with them and needing to be fixed because unfortunately I'm in the South. I don't know how it is in other areas, but there is still very much a something's wrong. We need to fix this. We need to make you as normal as possible by teaching you how to be neurotypical, basically. So I definitely can tell that would be a lot, and then on top of that, you're a girl, so, I did the episode with Dr. Lucas Harrington, the first episode about the
Mhm.
overlooked autistic traits in girls, and so do you feel like that played a role as well in, like, the expectations that people had of you and that you had of yourself?
Yeah, I think so. I think especially as, like, a Latina and an eldest daughter, like, you're really expected to keep it all together and to kinda be, model child perfect. And, like, I think my mom did a really good job of being like, "You don't have to be perfect, it's okay, just do your best, that's fine with me." But because of those cultural and societal expectations, I still put a lot of that on myself, and the rest of my family still put that on me, right? Like, I still had all that responsibility,
Mm,
um, and I think especially at school, like, you know, I was, um I was the first person in my family to, graduate college and everything, and so I think that a lot of that, even ever since I was a young kid in school, it was very much like, I have to be perfect in school. I got straight A's. I had a meltdown when I got my first B. Like, it was a lot, and I think, because I was doing so well in school, I think that a lot of folks didn't think I needed accommodations, right? Like, I was doing great academically, so, like, why I shouldn't need anything, and I think that, um, especially as a girl, like, I was able to kind of mimic and mask a lot. I was able to mimic and mask, pretty well, and so I was able to have friends or just, like, people I could surround myself with to not be alone at the lunch table, right? I would kinda, like, chameleon in and out to try to, fit in as much as I could, but then because of all that masking and all that difficulty and all the pressure that was put on me and of not being authentically myself and just kinda trying to fit in to survive, I would get home and I would kinda be a little bit of a monster. Like, I would lash out. I would constantly be lashing out. I'd be having breakdowns every day. Uh, I would be just, like, I would also be, like, sucked into my computer the whole time, just trying to kinda, like, regulate and
mm,
get everything out from the pressure of kind of being the perfect student, the perfect friend, the perfect, very normal girl at school every day.
that's a lot. That's
Yeah.
definitely a lot. Yeah, and a lot of educators might not even know that that's all that is going on, with their students. So, what are, I'd say, 2 to 3 challenges that neurodivergent students of color face that educators might not be aware of?
Yes. So, I think one of the biggest things, is kind of what I alluded to previously, which is that fear around labeling kids. And I think that the fear around labeling, students because of all the shame around it and all of the fear, all of that, that goes hand in hand with the idea of, like, asking for help is not something you do with someone outside of your family, right? So, if you pair this, like, "I don't want my kid labeled," with I don't want to even ask for supports or accommodations and advocate for it because that's an authority on something that I'm not that familiar with. I don't want to mess with that. Like, I don't want to ask for that help. Uh, then you get a student that does not have the diagnosis that they need to maybe access certain services, and then even then, the needs themselves cannot be kind of fulfilled because those accommodations aren't being asked for. Um, so I think that's a huge problem. And then back at home, what unfortunately tends to happen a lot is because of so much shame and fear around these diagnoses, uh, I've seen a lot of parents be extremely sheltering towards their kids of like, it starts out, kind of like, I don't want anyone knowing that my kid is different. And it starts to turn into, oh, my kid must be broken, must need to be fixed. You know what? They are not doing well in school, so I'm just gonna bring them back to homeschool, or I'm gonna bring them to just watch their siblings during the day, right? Like, if they're not doing well in school, they just must not be good at it, right? So they end up doing a lot of sheltering. Like, I've also heard of parents, pulling their kids out of extracurricular activities even because they were slower at learning them or that they weren't making friends and it was difficult for them. And so that shame tends to turn into sheltering, which comes from a good place, right? Of like, I don't want my kid to feel this pain or to feel
Mhm.
alone in this way. But in the long term, it's detrimental, right? Like it prevents the student from being able to like even try to get to these higher expectations. And it kind of reduces their potential, which they could have reached if they had, just been allowed to kind of try and fail, right? Um, I also think that there's, I kind of alluded to it back then, but earlier, but there are particular families that I've seen where they'll separate traits of autism into what is their child and what is the autism. They'll
Mhm.
treat them as separate things, even though you and your child, like your child, is autistic. Like that is part of and is who they are, right? But I think out of that shame, there's also a lot of like, for example, I know a couple parents who have been like, well, my kid is so smart. So how can they be so smart and also be autistic? Right? And so they will tend to attach these traits of being academically advanced or having an incredible memory. They'll attach that to their child. But then if there are traits that are seen not as socially positive, right? Like echolalia or being selectively speaking, they'll be like, oh, that's the autism. That's not my child. And so I think there's a big lack of education, and proper sort of equipping of resources and support for these parents to realize that, like, all of these traits are could be involved in being autistic. It's part of who a student is, and it's not a bad thing. It's just a
Mhm.
difference in processing, right? Um, and then the last, I think, issue that I would really want, educators to be aware of is the fact that, like, um in Hispanic culture, there's a lot of I guess I would call it like a respect for authority, but it's more than that. It's sort of a if someone is an authority or an expert on something, you leave it all to them, right? So, for example, there have been Latino parents who have have a child who might be experiencing behavioral issues at home. And sort of instead of kind of working with the child, or maybe they don't have the regulation skills or the time to be able to kind of sit down with their kid and kind of work things out and understand the root cause, they'll just instantly put them on the phone with the counselor and be like, they can deal with it. That's their problem. That's their job. Um, I don't know anything about it, so I'm just gonna let them do it, which kind of, you know, creates more and more of a detachment of what your kid as your kid actually needs, and makes it even harder to advocate for your child, especially when that professional may not be aware of certain aspects and doesn't know everything.
So what would you say the educator in that, uh, scenario can do? In those different scenarios, like, how can the educator help support the student who might be going through all of that at home and internally?
Yeah. I think that when it comes to talking to parents, like really emphasizing that what happens at home actually is important. It's more than just grades in school, right? Like, I think that, yeah, with being a teacher, I think you have to express that, like, it's really important that I know about everything, even if it doesn't relate directly to homework or grades. And I think that for supporting the student, I think especially encouraging them to ask for help and kind of building up that confidence of like, hey, if you ask me a question or if you ask for help, it might actually help you do better. And I'm not going to look at you as weak or think that, you're incapable. So I think especially building that strength of helping them be like, oh, I can ask for help and get that help and not be judged. Cool. I think that's actually a huge, huge aspect that kind of like starts to dismantle the shame. And I think, providing resources in Spanish and English that are more in depth about neurodiversity, especially, and about social emotional learning and how they are interconnected between home and school and not isolated environments. I think that's also really huge, is those multilingual resources.
That's a good idea, especially in places like where you are in California where there's a large Spanish-speaking population.
Yeah.
So and that also providing it in that way also doesn't make it seem like, just you just need to know it in English,
Mm,
it is showing, like, I value your language, I respect your language, and I wanna make sure that you get this information too. So, that's
exactly.
good. I do have a question about Social Cipher, but before I get to that, is there one message that you hope educators take away from this conversation about intersectionality and representation overall?
Yeah. I think that, first of all, it's super important to understand the root cause of behaviors and that a lot of the time, these behaviors are going to be attributed to the cultures that surround them. With these issues with asking for help or having shame around, who you are. Like those are huge and they're cultural and they're big, but like I think being informed about them and how they connect to behavior is huge. I also think like I do not think this is only the job of the teacher because teachers, like y'all, are so overloaded right now. But I think it's the job of teachers and administrators to be able to provide the resources necessary to guide and educate parents, especially monolingual parents who are Spanish speaking or majority Spanish speaking, right? Like, I think that that full education on autism and being able to help them dismantle the shame, dismantle the stereotypes and the stigmas around mental health, around neurodivergence. I think that is the first step to helping students with behavior challenges at home and at school. And helping them academically eventually too, because if they don't have that shame, I think that that unlocks a lot of ability for parents to actually advocate to get their kids diagnosed and not have fear around those labels. It also allows, students to be able to ask for help in the classroom and not have fear or or fear of judgment around it and get the help they need to, succeed academically. So I think that a lot of it starts with those multilingual resources that are nuanced and in depth and have information about neurodivergence, not just the textbook clinical definitions of autism and the most common ways to work with it, right? I'm talking about like how neurodivergence relates to identity and potential resources on intersectionality and how those might kind of relate to each other. Because I think especially in Latino culture and especially with monolingual families, there's a lot of hesitance and a lot of fear and distrust of a lot of these systems as well of like, "Oh, well, they don't understand me," or "They don't understand what it's like for us." So I think that having resources or people that can show that understanding and that, like you said, show respect for their language and their culture by providing it in multiple languages is huge.
Yeah. And I think you brought up a big point of, like, that distrust and feeling like, well, you don't understand. And at least from my experience in the school system and talking to a lot of other teachers, the truth is that they don't understand. Like,
Mhm.
a lot of educators and administrators don't really understand neurodivergence because when we were in school to become teachers, autism was looked at as, kind of like something's wrong. And this is how you help them. This is how you try to get them to be a little more normal. And so a lot of the educators and administrators also don't really have that knowledge in neurodiversity affirming perspective
Mm,
of autism, ADHD, and other types of neurodivergence. So it sounds like a lot of them need professional development to help them be able to learn so that they then can support the parents. It's so many different pieces to this puzzle to supporting students, and it doesn't fall on any one person.
mm,
But that's why I'm so glad that, companies like Social Cipher exist to provide that professional development, to create these products that support neurodivergent students and also can help the teachers learn as their students play. So I think that's pretty cool too. But from your perspective, how does Social Cipher bridge those gaps for neurodivergent students when it comes to intersectionality and representation?
yeah. I think that one of the biggest ways we do it, yeah, is through representation, right? Like, I think that and not only representation through our games, but on our team as well. Like, we're really lucky and honored to have like a team that is not only 50% neurodivergent, but is full of folks that come from all walks of life, various cultures and races and genders. Like it's awesome. And I think that that diversity really leads to a much richer story, much more nuanced characters and curriculum that, you know, is a little more culturally responsive and kind of sees and understands students for the various aspects and identities that they may possess. And I think in terms of representation, like with our characters, right? Like we have, I actually was able to voice the one word for, one of our 2 newest characters, Draven and Seb, who are both, Latino, and, uh, like, it was really cool. I actually got to revise the script, and bring my family in actually to help me out with adding some really authentic aspects of Latino culture into just like the interactions between a father and son and how they kind of like help out our main character Ava on their journey. I think it's been really cool to bring in a lot of those aspects from my own culture and kind of like even though like I was the one that kind of consulted on this, I'll read and I'll play the game and I feel seen. And I think that's really huge. I think even when you hear, like, Draven call Seb mijo, like, just those little things, you're like, "Oh, yeah, I kinda understand that." So I think, and, like, I also think that, we have a lot of our characters that bring in kind of various areas of their cultures, right? And they're nuanced and that have that intersectionality. Like we also have Red Braid, who is black and has ADHD and is also like a huge pop music fan, right? I kind of like the question that you asked of like when I started to embrace my neurodivergence and my kind of Latinidad, like I think it's kind of the same answer of like, I started to embrace that when I started seeing people all around me that may not have possessed all of the aspects that I had, but were possessing like bits and pieces of things that I could recognize that I used kind of to form my own identity, right? And to form my own confidence in that identity. And I think that's what we aim to do with the characters and the stories and our curriculum of Social Cipher is to help students give them sort of the puzzle pieces and the confidence to form a strong identity for themselves. If that especially if that's, an intersectional one.
Yay. I love that.
Yeah.
And I mean, not that I'm biased because I also am at Social Cipher, but from playing the game, I do feel like a lot of different cultures are represented in really cool ways without it being like stereotypical or, things like that because that's also an issue sometimes. It's just like putting stereotypes in there, just having everybody wearing a sombrero to show like, hey, you know, just so you know, this person is Mexican. So it's really good that, it's very authentic and not
Mhm.
forceful like what we do often see sometimes. And as a Black woman, I see that, the stereotypes out there and stuff when companies are trying to have that representation. So I think Social Cipher
Mhm.
does an awesome job with it. So if somebody wants to learn more about Social Cipher or more about you, where can they find you?
Yeah. So you can find us on Instagram at Social Cipher. You can also find us on LinkedIn at Social Cipher. Pretty much everywhere at Social Cipher, I think. I think on Facebook it's Social Cipher Game. You can also check out our website, which is socialcipher.com. We have a free social emotional learning resource library, as well as a blog series amazing, amazing resources that Diera and Christine, our curriculum writer, make together, and they are super valuable. You can also actually try playing our game if you make an account at play.socialcipher.com. Or actually, is that it?
If you go to socialcipher.com and click
Yes.
log in.
Okay. If you go to socialcipher.com and click login and create an account, you can also try playing Ava, our game series, for free and download our second episode of curriculum to try it out for yourself.
Sounds awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time to be a guest on the podcast. I'm really excited about people hearing this episode and learning more about you and what led to Social Cipher. And
Mm.
you know, maybe they can let their students hear it too, so they can feel, that representation. I feel like this is a really good conversation that needed to be had. So thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it, and it's been nice to be able to talk about, yeah, my own intersectional identity because it's hard to be able to fully talk about that. So, yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.